Historian by training, but I'm also a Jewish educator and somebody who loves to bring programs that bring the community in here and engages all of us in issues that are of interest and import to us. And I think that Hasia's new book perfectly fits that bill. So I'll give you a little housekeeping details. We are grateful to FCTV for recording this for later broadcast to spread word to the rest of the community, and to Eight Cousins Bookshop. They are here with copies of Hasia's book for you to purchase afterwards, and at the bookstore. We have, very importantly, we have 3 exits in this room. The big one out there that goes straight to the courtyard, and these 2 exit doors on either side, just like an airplane. And but things happen, and it's important to know how to get out. Restrooms are at the end of the hallway, and if you need to leave at any point, you can go through those doors down the hall. I'll put out some more cookies for you. Importantly, if you could, please turn off or silence your phones. I also want to mention that we have a variety of book talks, some fiction, mostly nonfiction, but it's a mix of in-person and virtual. And our next talk is on Thursday, November 21st, with Professor Historian Sam Casso from Trinity College, himself a great historian, and especially of the book about the Onid Shabbos archival movement within the Warsaw Ghetto. And he is the translator of a memoir by Rochel Auerbach called Warsaw Testament. Very, very powerful story of her life, of Jewish culture before and during the war and after. She then went to Israel and was very instrumental in the testimony project of Yad Vashem. So I encourage you to join with that. That's at 7 o'clock in the evening on Zoom. So from the comfort of your home, and I believe that FCTV will record that, and we'll record it and broadcast it later. And then we have another one in December, but you can read all about those on the FJC website. Yes, question?
Where do we watch the TV recording?
Of this?
Yeah, or anything.
So FCTV doesn't make them like openly available. They broadcast them at specific times. So I will let our own membership know when this will be broadcast. And you can always check, do a search on their website for any of the programs. It is streamed on FCTV's site, so it's a specific streaming time.
I see.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Today, after a brief introduction now, Hasia Diner will speak, and then there's time for Q&A at the end. So that everybody can hear questions, I will come around with a mic if you would allow that at the end, and then book sales again afterwards. So I want to tell you something about Hasia. A year ago, Hasia Diner retired after an illustrious career at New York University. She served as the Paul and Sylvia Steinberg Professor of American Jewish History, and you're continuing to serve as the Goldstein Corin Center? Almost finished Center for American Jewish History, and you headed the Irish Studies.
For a year, yeah.
Yep, department. So I'm reading now from a really wonderful article that appeared in JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, online, about a symposium in Hasia Diner's honor, just to give you a flavor for how important her work is in her field. It would be impossible to overstate Diner's impact on the study of American Jewish history. A brilliant and unusually prolific writer, she authored and edited 21 major volumes over the course of her storied career. Most distinguished historians author no more than 5. Even more unusually, her work has consistently disrupted unexamined assumptions and broken new ground in the field. A social historian of the highest caliber, she examines history from the perspectives of the everyday people who lived it, taking on topics as disparate as Black-Jewish relations, immigrant foodways, Jewish women's history, and Holocaust memory. Her interests have always been as capacious as they are innovative. She has earned the highest honors in the field, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, the Lee Max Friedman Award for Distinguished Service from the American Jewish Historical Society, the Saul Wiener Prize for Outstanding Books in American Jewish History, and a James Beard nomination for food writing, and numerous National Jewish Book Awards. Hasia Diner has been an important mentor for slews of distinguished American Jewish historians, and we are so delighted and honored that you've taken the time to be with us today.
Okay, thank you. And, first, I should encourage you to come to or listen to Sam Casso's work. He's an amazing speaker, a brilliant guy. Okay, and so let me begin. Obviously, this is a complicated moment, and I think probably for many of us, just the news of the last couple of days, but in the spirit of, life must go on, and perhaps it's even a bit uplifting to hear something of a very different kind of nature. So I want to thank the JCC for inviting, the congregation for inviting me, and for the Irish group in the community for also helping to sponsor this. So I also want to shout out to my great friend Mike Birch, decades, who's actually given me lots of information over the years about Irish life in Worcester and his growing up and so on. Okay, so no further ado. Okay, so a songwriting duo, two composers who churned out many songs, all pretty silly, from New York's Tin Pan Alley in the early 20th century. William Jerome, who was born William Flannery of Irish immigrant parents, and Jean Schwartz, an immigrant, Jewish immigrant from Hungary, produced in 1912 a lighthearted piece, but one which I would say packs a real historical punch. The song was entitled "If It Wasn't for the Irish and the Jews," and in this song, the two extolled America, which they called Yankee Land, as the only place where they, child of Irish immigrants, a Jewish immigrant, could come together and make music. Along with so many other Irish and Jews, they, the song tells us, drove away the blues, okay, and according to the lyrics, in the process transformed the little USA. So I'm going to read a bit from the song. I promise I will not sing it. You wouldn't like that. So it begins. I just returned from Europe. I've seen London and Paris, and I'm glad to get back to Yankee Land. In fact, the little USA looks better now to me. It's a real place with real folks who understand. But I often think, what would this country be if it wasn't for men like Rosenstein and Hughes? We'd surely have a kingdom there, but there'd be no democracy if it wasn't for the Irish and the Jews. What would this great Yankee nation really do if it wasn't for a Levy, a Monahan, or Donahue? Okay, now the song goes on, and I'm gonna just give you one little bit from the penultimate verse. They're talking about theater and popular culture. And so the song says, I once heard Dave Belasco. So David Belasco is a Jewish theater kind of an impresario, really quite important in the early 20th century. I once even heard David Belasco say, you couldn't stage a play today if it wasn't for the Irish and the Jews. So to end the little song, talk about a combination, heed my words and make a note. On St. Patrick's Day, Rosinski pins a shamrock on his coat. There's a sympathetic feeling between the Blooms and McAdoos. White Tammany, and again, I'm sure everybody knows Tammany Hall is kind of the sort of top of the political machines of the late 19th, early 20th century. White Tammany would surely fall. Actually, there'd really be no hall at all if it wasn't for the Irish and the Jews. So the song was recorded many, many times. It was offered as sheet music, so you could play it on your piano in your parlor. It was performed at various kind of venues. It provides us, however, with a starting point to think about the alchemy of what happened when Irish Catholics and Jewish immigrants, along with their descendants, worked together in urban America and remade the nation. So the history of the United States, and obviously that could go on for days and days, was in part shaped by the arrival of millions of Catholic women and men from Ireland starting in the 1840s, and then millions of Jews from Eastern Europe starting in about the 1870s, both of which groups arrived as permanent immigrants. Their numbers, their participation in the labor force alone make them significant players in American history, but so too their involvement with politics, the labor movement, education, and popular culture, like if it weren't for the Irish and the Jews, changed their adopted land. Upon arrival, these largely working class women and men had no choice to come to terms with the reality that although they were, or I should say the men, were capable of becoming citizens, as religious outsiders, they confronted a deeply Protestant, militantly at times American public, which defined America as theirs, and the Jews and the Irish as outsiders, incapable of real citizenship, that is, cultural citizenship. The Irish and Jewish newcomers as individuals and through the actions of their leaders worked together to dislodge this nativist conceit and to move the nation to a much more inclusive mode. So beginning, as a kind of starting point, remember these are two groups who would have never known each other, had they not come to the United States. Okay, they were outside of each other's orbit, and they met in America and in American cities. So they would have never known each other before, but once they came to the United States, they bumped into each other in apartment buildings, on street corners, in shops, in schools, on playgrounds. Jewish and Irish soldiers during World War I in the same units. Some of them met in Tin Pan Alley, like Jerome and Schwartz. It seems to have been a pretty, we don't, from the ordinary experience, we can't really know, because it's not necessarily documented, but there were lots of romances and marriages, pointing to a pretty positive interaction. But they also met each other in much more formal settings, in classrooms, in labor union meeting halls, and in the smoke-filled back rooms of sundry political organizations like Tammany Hall. They met each other and they interacted not out of a belief in cultural pluralism or what we might call multiculturalism today. They weren't particularly interested in breaking down boundaries between their two communities. Both were pretty committed to who they were and what they were, but they figured out that they needed each other as they both took their steps into American society. Now, in this American drama, which I'm going to sketch out today, I give top billing to the Irish Catholics. This is primarily their story, whether they were immigrants or the American-born descendants of those immigrants, who were the, shall we say, shapers and molders of this encounter. Jews, obviously, are very important to the story, because without them there would be no story, but they were the receivers. They were the students, they were those who were guided by the Irish who had come before them. Now, I do need to say that this is not the way this story is usually told. Okay, so in American Jewish memory, in American Jewish popular culture, even in a lot of the scholarship, this encounter is based around pretty negative incidents or negative tropes highlighting conflict, competition, and struggle. Many of the narratives emphasize the presence, pretty common, of low-level street violence, often perpetrated by Irish boys, always young men or boys, against usually Jewish boys. So it's not about women, it's not about adults, but it's about this kind of boy trouble on the streets. So too, a lot of the American Jewish rhetoric has pointed to or has made much of the of sermons and other speeches delivered by Catholic priests who thundered to their parishioners about the perfidy of the Jews, eternally guilty of the crucifixion. In the 1930s, the rantings and ravings of Father Charles Coughlin, the flamboyant radio priest out of Detroit, who through his broadcasts reached about 40 million listeners a week, was a slew, which was a barrage of anti-Semitic trope of the worst kind. In 1938, right after Kristallnacht, his next broadcast began with the phrase, "Wait till Hitler comes to America." Okay, Coughlin, spewing forth on the vast power of the international Jewish conspiracy, has in fact given historians much to work with. A few decades later in Boston, Father Leonard Feeney, in the late 1940s, regularly climbed on a soapbox in the Boston Common and preached to anyone who fell in his listening zone on the evils of the Jews, who he always called the Sheenies. In fact, people referred to him as Sheeny Feeney, usually mocking him. Now, I'm not saying that these things didn't happen. They obviously did, but that's just not the whole story. And what I hope to do is offer you the other side of the story and leave it to you to determine which one made history, which one made the Irish, which one made the Jews, and which one made the United States. So I want to look at a few different zones of this Irish mentorship, Jewish receiving of Irish guidance, of Jews as the beneficiaries of this tutelage from the larger, much more vociferous, much more militant group. So the first, and on my notes I have it called the Defenders of the Jews. Okay, and from the 1870s on, there was a kind of string of examples of Irish community leaders who spoke out for the Jews against anti-Semitism. So in Boston in the 1870s, Rabbi Solomon Schindler turned specifically to John Boyle O'Reilly and his successor Jeffrey Roach, who were the editors of the Boston Pilot, to use the pages of the Pilot to condemn anti-Semitism locally, nationally, and indeed globally. Roach and O'Reilly were very happy to work with Schindler. They offered Schindler space in the Pilot to speak about Jews, Jewish history, Judaism. And these two Irish nationalists, and we know O'Reilly was actually banished from England and had a very long journey till he got to Boston. So very deeply involved in the community, editors of the local community Catholic paper in Boston, seems to have taken a lot of pleasure in ferreting out anti-Semitism, particularly when perpetrated by the local Boston Protestant elite. Okay, that is their own enemies. And so when the Brahmins, or often if it was associated with Harvard, did something against Jews, it got front page in the Boston Pilot. It's also interesting that O'Reilly's daughter, who became a journalist also in 1913, was the first American journalist to travel to the city of Kiev in Ukraine to interview Mendel Bayless, who was accused of having killed a Christian child for her blood. Not boy, his blood, and it was the blood libel, and there was a big trial of Bayless in Kiev, and it was Agnes O'Reilly, who was the American reporter, who met with him, and her newspaper articles were full of, again, expositions about anti-Semitism, and in one of the articles, in a kind of black box, she wrote, "Anti-Semitism is the greatest sin of Christianity." Okay, now, this was not just an isolated Boston story or not just an isolated O'Reilly story, but in New York, it has a chapter that begins also in the 1880s, when a number of very notable American Jewish, New York Jewish community leaders, who are also therefore American Jewish community leaders, approached a man by the name of Charles P. Daly, born in County Galway, a sitting Chief Justice of the New York Court of Common Pleas, president of the Ancient Order of Hibernians, They asked him to first deliver some speeches and then to write a book in defense of the Jews. His articles and the book published by the American Hebrew was simply entitled "The Settlement of the Jews in North America." It was a rousing tribute to the Jews. He pointed out that Jews were not recent immigrants. They'd been there since the 17th century. So how can other people call them aliens? He noted that they always took care of their own poor. They contributed tremendously to the larger society. And in that book, as well as one that documented the history of the Jews of New York, he made the point over and over again that they were the finest citizens America could ever have. So we might pause for a second and say, why would Schindler turn to O'Reilly? Why would Philip Cowan and Max Kohler turn to Charles P. Daly? And the reality was that the words coming out of their mouths could never be mistaken as special pleading. But rather these were the words of well-established Irish Americans who couldn't have any personal stake in this issue. So too in April 1903, right after the bloody riot, pogrom in Kishinev, the globetrotting journalist, Irish nationalist Michael Davitt went to this Moldavian city, Kishinev, which now has some totally other spelling since it's no longer part of the Russian Empire. And he went to document what happened there, why had these bloodthirsty mobs descended upon the Jewish community, slaughtered, raped, pillaged, destroyed property. He went there in the employ of the Hearst newspapers, and when he came back, he was met by a number of Jewish notables associated with the Jewish Publication Society of America, a press that still exists, and asked Davitt if he would turn his articles into a book. Okay? And the book was to inform the American public of the tremendous oppression that Jews were suffering in the Russian Empire, and the book was published at a time when the issue of immigration and immigration restriction was very much on the American political agenda. And they hoped that Davitt's words would show the American public, members of Congress in particular, that the Jews had to be able to come to America, that they could not stay in the Russian Empire, be it Moldavia or elsewhere. The book, called Within the Pale, the true story of anti-Semitic persecution in Russia, was the first book published about the Kishinev pogroms. It was the closest thing to an eyewitness coverage in the English language. So to just forward a few decades, in 1924, a Jewish author by the name of George Cohen published a book called Jews in the Making of America. And while it would seem as though it has no connection to this story I'm telling you about Irish as spokesman for the Jews, it is notable that the book came out under the imprimatur of the Knights of Columbus, okay, obviously a solidly Catholic organization, Irish founders, and the president of the Knights of Columbus, a man by the name of Edward McSweeney, was very disturbed by the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, the outbursts of xenophobia, violence against both Catholics and Jews, I shouldn't say both, against Catholic Jews and African Americans. And McSweeney envisioned that the Knights of Columbus would publish a whole kind of shelf load of books called The Racial Contribution to the United States. Okay, only 3 books got published, but one of them was George Cohen's The Jew in the Making of America. And like Charles P. Daly before him, he made the point that, quote, the Jew has made himself a part of American life. Okay, and I just want to offer one very small other, slightly later example of this. So in 1936, as you may be aware, the Olympics were to be held in Berlin. And there was a question about should the United States participate in this, since who would be presiding over the Olympics but none other than Adolf Hitler. The movement to get the United States to boycott, the unsuccessful move to get the United States to boycott the Olympics was led by one Jeremiah Mahoney. Okay, a judge in New York who hoped to become mayor. Okay, he was also president of the AAU, the Amateur Athletic Union, so he was on the the board for the American Olympic team. And Mahoney made it very clear that as an American, as a public servant, and yes, as an Irish Catholic, he could no longer continue to serve on the board when the board decided the United States would go to Berlin and shake hands with Adolf Hitler. Okay, so this kind of advocacy, okay, it's mostly in words, a little bit of it is action, but words matter. But let's look at some action of a much more very concrete nature. So in that lighthearted song with which I began, if it wasn't for the Irish Jews, the Irish and the Jews, you know, there's a sympathetic feeling between the Blooms and McAdoos. Tammany would surely fall. In fact, there'd be no hall at all if it wasn't for the Irish and the Jews. Well, Jews coming to America, starting again in the late 1870s, and settling for the most part in the largest cities, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Boston, Buffalo, Cleveland, Detroit, and so on, entered into a world in which Irish men dominated the world of local politics. From the hallways of apartment buildings to the street corners and all the way up, they had learned as of the 1860s how to make politics theirs and to use it to serve their communal ends. Okay, this, needless to say, threw the American Protestant native-born elite into an absolute panic. Okay, and one only has to read Henry Adams' words when he said he was leaving because the mayor now of Quincy, Massachusetts was an Irishman. What's happened to my America, Henry Adams wrote. Now, this role of the Irish in American urban politics was very important for their own communities. It paved the way for all subsequent white male immigrants, Jews included. For the Jews, this encounter with Irish politicians represented an absolutely new moment in their history. They came from places where, in fact, they weren't citizens. Anyone from the Russian Empire, just by any Jew from the Russian Empire was by definition not a citizen. And even those places of the Austro-Hungarian Empire where they did have citizenship, they had no idea about the rough and tumble of American urban politics, trading favors, group negotiations, all getting only one thing mattered: who you voted for. They had never been, the Jewish immigrants had never been partners in a kind of dance of being courted and wooed and appealed to by non-Jewish men, those with seemingly great power and influence, who actually had only one goal in mind: I want your vote. Vote for me. So at some level, it made them equals in American society. And in every city to which they went, Jewish men encountered Irish politicians, from those ward captains to the block captains to all the way up the rungs of the political machine, who lusted after their votes. Okay, again, after all, every vote counted. Okay, even if they were bought off by a little corruption here and there, but every vote counted. And the votes of the Jews were no different than anyone else's. So Irish politicians showed up at Jewish weddings and funerals, at bar mitzvah, at b'nai mitzvah, at synagogue dedications, at meetings of B'nai B'rith lodges, at the Landsmannschaft meetings, these hometown societies from primarily Poland, and so many other places where Jews gathered and where they could shake hands and make friends and get votes. So Big Tim Sullivan, who is one of the kind of most colorful operatives of Tammany Hall, actually set up a little table in the vestibule of Congregation Beis HaMedrash Gadol on the Lower East Side, and he had his little table there every Monday and Thursday when services ended. Okay, and as you know, Monday and Thursday, the Torah is read, men were coming there to say Kaddish, and when they would come out of the synagogue, who would they see in the lobby but Big Tim or one of his lieutenants? And it was the handshake, and it was, what can I do for you? Okay, and the what can I do for you actually has a tremendous kind of practical input. One of my greatest sources in writing this were the day books of somebody who, there's no reason you would have heard of him, Johnny Ahern. He was a Tammany Hall operative. He had a couple stints in jail for whatever malfeasance. He ended up as the borough president of Manhattan. But Johnny's day books were full of letters from Jewish constituents to Johnny. Okay, my son is in jail. Can you possibly get him a furlough for the Jewish holidays? My daughter is looking for a teaching job. Okay, I heard it's possible to get a contract on some bridge or some other development. Is there any way you can help me? Okay, likewise, and there are so many of them, I couldn't even begin to just write down the narrative in each one, all amazing stories. I was fined by, because I violated the Sunday Blue laws. At that time in New York and in Boston and elsewhere, you couldn't operate your business on Sunday, because it was the Christians' Lord Day. And for Jewish merchants, this was terrible, because many of them wouldn't work on Saturday either. So their business was certainly diminished. So I got a fine from the local policeman. Can you get me out of that? Okay, and Johnny's letters are always, absolutely. Okay. Likewise, Johnny writes for 2 city officials. Okay, often translating or often conveying these questions or these requests from the constituents. In one case, he writes to the Parks Commissioner, and he says, my Hebrew constituents would like to see in Central Park a food pavilion during their upcoming holiday, obviously Passover, when they cannot eat the food being sold at the other food establishments in the park. Now, I never saw the reverse, the back letter from the Parks Commissioner, but Johnny is doing for them. At one point, the Kosher Poultry Association writes Johnny saying, we're having trouble with the managers of the Jefferson Street Market. And Johnny says, you know what? I'll go and represent you. So there's Johnny Ahern going to the board of the Jefferson Street Market, representing the kosher chicken slaughterers. Okay, now again, we don't think Johnny had any reason to care about consumption of kosher chicken or kosher for Passover food. These were all voters, and voters were good. In the early 20th century, Tammany Hall actually provided the funds for the publication of one of the city's, it didn't last very long, but one of the city's Yiddish newspapers, their Wahrheit, okay, which all the other Yiddish journalists said was just a Tammany Hall rag. But the fact was it had literature, it had world news, it had all the stuff you'd expect in a newspaper in Yiddish, all courtesy of Tammany Hall. So here too then is another way in which this connection played itself out, and which the Irish had, the Jews wanted, okay, and it was a mutually convenient relationship, in as much as the Irish politicians recognized that the only way they were going to stay in power is if they got votes from outside their group. Okay, Mayor Curley, by the way, in Boston, facing this exact question about how to expand the base of his operation, because again, the Irish percentage and numbers were dropping after the big migrations from Eastern and Southern Europe. And Curley said, you know what, I'm not interested in the Italians. Okay, they don't vote. I want the Jews. Okay, so the Jews got, okay, I can't say whatever they wanted, but they certainly got a lot and came out to vote for Curley over and over again. One memoirist says, my father was a socialist, but he still voted for Curley. Okay, so the next zone is we might call the lessons of labor. So Jewish immigrants who came to America, particularly after the 1870s, streamed into the sweatshops and then the garment factories of the large cities. They faced horrendous working conditions. They worked for pittance. Their sense of worth, their sense of dignity was violated. The conditions of their labor was harsh. Okay, the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Fire certainly gives us one example of that harshness. Their labor organizations, particularly the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which was founded in 1900, and the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, founded in 1914, provided them eventually with very powerful tools to improve the quality of their lives, foster their mobility, and shape the future of their children to not have to go and work in factories. Names like David Dubinsky, Rose Schneiderman, Bessie Abramowitz, Sidney Hillman, Fanya Cohn, Pauline Newman, and many other Jewish labor leaders have been considered heroes of American Jewish history, particularly written by those who have a slightly more progressive or leftish orientation. But every single one of them was mentored by an Irish labor activist who taught them how to do this kind of work. So I'm just going to offer one example of this, although again, there are so many. So actually, let me, before my one example, it is notable that when the Jews arrived in the United States, the American labor movement, however small it was and however struggling, was essentially Irish. Irish women, Irish men had been there with the Knights of Labor, and then the founding of the American Federation of Labor. And wherever Jews looked for anyone to turn to about how to organize, how to unionize, how to extract concessions from my employer, they had only one source of information, one source of advice, and that were these Irish women and men who came before them. So here's my one example. So you may be familiar with the name Sidney Hillman, who was the longtime president of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union, an immigrant from Lithuania. He was in Chicago. He worked in a men's clothing factory, sewing men's suits. And he was a member of the United Garment Workers, which was a union he found inadequate for the needs of the labor force among the laborers among whom he worked. And he wanted to form a rival union, okay, which was sort of a no-no. But he wanted to form a rival union that was going to be really much more powerful and inclusive, and they had no idea how to do it. So he turns to a man named John Fitzpatrick, okay, who is the head of the Chicago Federation of Labor, who Hillman said gave him some great pieces of advice, but the most important was he sent them to a woman named Agnes Nestor, the daughter of Irish immigrants who had founded the Glovemakers Union. Nestor, in her memoir, wrote, "Can you believe I taught Sidney Hillman how to engage in collective bargaining and to found a union?" Hillman, by the way, by the 1930s had risen to the kind of pinnacles of the American labor movement, and it was said that when Roosevelt ever had a labor question, he said, "Clear it with Sidney." So there would have been no clear it with Sidney without John Fitzpatrick or Agnes Nestor. So too on the women's side of the equation, Irish-born Leonora O'Reilly, as well as Irish-American Mary Kenny O'Sullivan, played a fundamental role in the organizing of Jewish women. So by 1925, Jewish women made up 1/4 of all organized women workers in the Union in the United States, and their path from exploited sweatshop workers, from workers who were essentially dismissed by the Jewish leadership of the male Jewish leadership of the Union, their path into union activism came from women like Leonora O'Reilly, Mary Kenny O'Sullivan, and so many more. So there again was a kind of mentorship, okay, a direct path by which Irish teachers took on Jewish students. Okay, that teacher-student relationship actually has an even greater impact, which is in the fourth zone that I want to look at here, I want to share with you, which is by the time the Jewish immigrants arrived, again, the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, this again goes on into the 1920s, the reality was that the majority of public school teachers in the big cities in New York, Chicago, Boston, and Providence, Worcester, and so on, were Irish women. These were the daughters of Irish immigrant women who were attracted to the profession of school teaching. It was good work, it was clean work, it was more than respectable work. Usually, until again about the 1920s, women could you had to work through the political machine to get the job in the first place, so they had a kind of pipeline into it. And when the Jewish immigrants disembarked at first Castle Garden and then Ellis Island, their children who had been born abroad went directly into American classrooms, where more likely than not they met in school teachers, Irish women, or Irish American women, who served as their models of what it meant to be American. These schools served as crucial settings in which American teachers taught Jewish kids how to be American. Irving Howe, in his great big book, The World of Our Fathers, has made a comment, having gone through so many memoirs about these Irish school teachers. He said, there must have been a bigot or two among them, but not if you read the memoir literature. Rather, the people, the adults, who became who then become the writers of memoirs, talk with just warmth and admiration about the teachers who had guided them into the ways of being American. So these Irish American women, again, mostly the daughters of immigrants, probably most of their mothers had been domestic servants. Okay, served on the front line of exposing newly arrived Jewish immigrant children to what it meant to be American. They showed them by how they dressed, okay, how they wore their hair, how they spoke the English language, the ideal of the American middle class. It mattered very little that these women had been, again, mostly the daughters of the working class, fathers maybe in construction or unskilled labor, and mothers former domestic servants, to the Jewish immigrant children fresh from Lithuania, Ukraine, Belarus, Galicia, and elsewhere, and their awestruck parents. These women were the standard bearers of American culture. They led the Jewish children in the Pledge of Allegiance, taught them the words, led them to sing patriotic songs, informed them about Lincoln, Washington, all the other heroes of American life, along with drilling them in spelling, in the times tables, and all the stuff one learns in particularly elementary school. These Irish American women functioned as the key players in the project of Jewish integration, with the Jewish children entering many classrooms with no English. I mean, they didn't know English, and their parents certainly didn't, yet expected by their parents to master the skills of American life. Okay, again, the memoirs are just full of amazing stories of this kind of awestruck children, the support of teachers. One man who grew up to become a journalist said, I was a really terrible student. Okay, but Miss O'Connor knew I could do better, so she gave me the role of reciting, all of them seem to do Longfellow poems, reciting the Ride of Paul Revere at the assembly to which the parents were invited. So he said, none of the parents knew any English. But there he was, this kind of kid who didn't do well in school, getting up and reciting perfectly, listen, my children, and you shall hear. And said his mother said, maybe actually you'll become something. Okay, so one cannot even understate the importance of who the teachers were and their relationship to the students. We know actually a little bit more about this than some of the, we know one of the reasons, even though this played itself out in one classroom after another, and we can't know too much of it, too much about any one experience, we do know about a woman named Myra Kelly, who came from Dublin. She actually was somewhat better off than most of the Irish immigrants, for sure. Her father was a doctor. He set up his practice on the Lower East Side, had an exclusively Jewish clientele. And like many of her peers, Myra Kelly became a teacher, and she worked for a few years at public school, in New York, you do it that way, PS 147, on the Lower East Side. And we know about Myra Kelly because after she gave up school teaching, she became a writer. And she wrote a series of stories and then books about her years teaching in the Lower East Side classroom. And her books are entitled Little Citizens, Little Aliens, Wars of Liberty. She wrote with great warmth about, again, the Russian Jewish children, their parents, who were, in the words we might say, clueless about what was going on, and the work of Miss Bailey in exposing the children and making the parents feel welcome. Now, this story continues into the 1920s as the daughters of Jewish immigrants then become school teachers themselves. And here they met Irish women as their seasoned colleagues in the schools, as the principals, and in a variety of other, again, settings in which the Jews were the neophytes, the Irish, the veterans. Many Irish Americans, school teachers, went on to actually teach at normal schools, training the next generation of teachers. And one Jewish woman who attended the Maxwell Training School in Brooklyn, who then went on to a long career as a New York City school teacher, in oral history offered an incredible detail of this Irish teacher, Jewish student at the level of normal school training. And so she said that these were all Jewish girls in the Maxwell Training School, and she said our teachers were all the daughters of Irish immigrants, most of whose mothers had been domestic servants, and she said in only the finest homes, and I have my air quotes here. And according to this informant, the Maxwell educators had learned from their mothers, these one-time servants, the quote, oh so proper manners, and they tried to teach them to us as well. In the spirit of noblesse oblige, we, meaning the Jewish girls, were forever being invited to their apartments, okay, for genteel tea parties. Okay, and then what I thought was just one of the best lines, she says, we who drank black tea from glasses at home were taught how to drink tea from China, okay, and to learn to raise our pinkies while we drank the tea. So she said, their faculty members, the tea drinking, the instructors in tea drinking, as well as pedagogy, told us that, quote, to be a teacher was meant to be, one had to be a lady, and we should be learn to be ladies by emulating them. And then there's a little bit of a negative note here, implying that we Jewish women had no idea what a lady meant and needed help in this. Now, how she felt about it at the time, we don't know. This is decades later. But again, the story is so graphic, okay, of the faculty members inviting their students to teach them how to drink tea like an American lady. Okay, and finally, one last setting, and then I'm going to be looking forward to your questions. One last setting in which this took place as Irish teachers, as Irish institutions lifted up and opened their doors to Jews, involves a range of Catholic universities which opened their doors to Jewish students. At universities like Notre Dame, Fordham, Georgetown, Creighton in Omaha, Providence College, Loyola of Chicago, DePaul of Chicago, St. John's, and so many others, both in pre-professional programs as well as in the professionals programs, law, medicine, dentistry, pharmacy, business. The Catholic universities made themselves safe places for Jewish students as other American universities erected barriers to Jewish admission. Now, while even some Jewish undergraduates attended these schools, and their story would probably be really interesting. There were a couple of Jewish students who played on the Notre Dame football team, okay, and probably wore their Fighting Irish jerseys. In most cases, these were, it was in these professional schools where Catholic universities, where their Irish founders, administrators, alumni, boards of trustees, and faculty saw the Jewish students as qualified applicants who would pay tuition. okay, and performed satisfactorily, certainly no less well than anyone else, and would go on to bring prestige and glory to their institutions. Okay, for some of these schools and their shareholders, the admission of Jewish students, nearly all of whom were men, although law schools like Fordham and St. John's, as well as the pharmacy schools at those two, which happen to be the ones I studied most thoroughly, may have had a commitment to interfaith work, because this was something that actually developed during World War I, of Catholics, Protestants, Jews coming together to look at, in a kind of formal setting, the ways in which they could cooperate with each other. For most of these, the administrators and faculty of these Catholic universities, the admission of Jewish students served a very utilitarian purpose. Okay, they could pay tuition, okay, pure and simple. Once they did well, they might go on to become loyal donors and advocates for the school. So Louis Lefkowitz, who was the longtime treasurer of the state of New York, attended Fordham Law School. He lived in the Bronx. His parents ran a candy store. He couldn't afford to go anyplace else. Columbia had quotas, so he went to Fordham. And the rest of his life, he raised money for Fordham, he attended their banquets, he served on the board of trustees, and the like. Okay, but more than, and just to say that when he attended Fordham, it was about 15% Jewish. In the early 20th century, by the 1920s, it was just under 50%. Okay, whereas at St. John's, it was probably closer to 60%. Okay, and that was true also of the pharmacy schools in both of those. And Fordham at one point actually had a Jewish dean of the pharmacy school. Okay, and it was, Fordham was Jesuit, and one of the officials of the order coming from Rome, happened to be Polish, visited the various schools in the United States, and he was appalled that a Jesuit university like Fordham would have a Jewish dean, and demanded that the president replace him. And the president said, no, he's actually our best dean, our best fundraiser, we're keeping him. So, so that this became a kind of major trend again in the teens, 20s, 30s. Notably, in 1922, when Harvard publicly announced its quotas on Jewish students, it was going to cap any incoming class to 10% Jewish. Loyola of Chicago printed articles or advertisements in the local Chicago Jewish newspapers, both the English language papers and in the Yiddish paper, welcoming the admission, the application from Jewish students to Loyola. So beyond the realm of the obvious, the fact is this took place at its height, this Loyola versus Harvard in the 1920s, and this mattered a great deal. This was the decade of when the Ku Klux Klan achieved respectability, political visibility, targeting both Jews and Catholics. The quota system, which cropped up at colleges and universities around the 1920s, beginning in real measure in the 1920s, directed at Jewish students, reflected the same kind of spirit of prejudice and xenophobia which underlay the growth of the Klan. So these Catholic professional schools declared by virtue of their admissions policies that they didn't share in the prejudice of the rest of American society. They made a statement that as Catholics and as Irish, and sometimes quite openly so, that they didn't share in the hatred of the Jews. They made a statement that those people, those Americans, who saw them, Irish Catholics, as illiberal, bigoted, medieval, okay, were in fact the ones who were illiberal and bigoted, because they, the Catholic schools, admitted Jews, the others put up barriers. The Catholic schools opened doors, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, so on, closed their doors. So this is going to bring me full circle, and I'll end with this, and we'll go back to the song. In all these ways and places, I would call them places of allyship, okay, witness Jews deriving benefit from Irish guidance, and Irish benefiting from the guidance that they gave. It was a great quid pro quo, and they helped each other, And together, the two helped, as the song said, to make democracy. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have time for Q&A for a few minutes, and as I said, for the sake of everybody's being able to hear and for recording on the TV, if you have a question, I would ask you to raise your hand.
Okay, great. Hi, I think this is a fabulous talk. I'm particularly, sorry. I think that information about the colleges and the universities is so enlightening, because I always thought, so many people ask, what schools are safe for Jewish students to go to, and you always think, the Ivies and the state schools versus the Catholic schools, but they've just such a different perspective now.
Okay, great. So that's a great question. And one thing, 1920 was not 2020. Okay, so it's a completely different landscape. But it is a really notable history, and I think what's to me really striking is that historians who have written about the history of Jewish exclusion have never looked at the Catholic schools. All they look at is the Ivies, and that seems to be all that they care about. But in fact, few people went to Ivies, and it was the Catholic schools that in a way took up the slack. And so in one study from the 1930s, it said that a third of all Jewish lawyers in New York had either gone to Fordham or St. John's. Okay, so this is not an insignificant, statistically insignificant, and was a kind of comment on what options Jewish students had, and the willingness of institutions to say, we don't care.
So what exactly was it that brought them together to begin with? Was it just that they were new and the Irish took them under the wing, or?
Well, they didn't particularly love each other. Again, that was not the issue. But rather, the Jews were new. They needed, they were staying. They weren't going back, and were faced with or had the challenge of how to integrate into this new place, how to overcome poverty, how to make their lives better, okay, how to get what they wanted, how to get the state to protect them, how to get the United States to, in a sense, intercede for their friends and relatives left back in the old world, back in particularly the Russian Empire. And they recognized, hey, we can't do this on our own. We are about 2% of the population. There is no way that they could do this on their own. They didn't have the schools. They didn't have the unions. These were, nothing's natural, but the Irish were great choices as allies, because there was actually nobody else who was going to fill that role. Okay, and from the point of view of the Irish, serving the Jews was a way to prove their own Americanism, to prove their liberalism, and to, again, hold on to power and hold on to influence. So I think the word is usually quid pro quo. You do for me, I'll do for you, but somebody has to do is first place in the doing. Okay, somebody's doing, somebody's asking. And so again, it's not about ideology, these are wonderful people, I really want to get to know them, but rather it works for us. Okay. I'll start back here.
So who taught the Irish about politics? Did they bring it over from Ireland, or did they learn it from another group that had preceded them here in America?
Oh, so that's, a great question. I'd say there are probably about 80 books in the library on why the Irish did so well in politics. So, look, on the one hand, they arrived in the United States as white people, so they have the ability to get into the political system. They arrived in a way at the same time that almost every state allowed for universal white male voting, okay, and got rid of property qualifications for voting. and some of the New England states had religious qualifications until the 1820s, so that's gone. And they came in such huge numbers, okay? And now one might say nobody taught them because they named it. They defined what this kind of urban machine would look like, and that they were met with just such hostility. And again, it was like, oh my God, the world is over. The Irish are taking over New York, Boston, Providence, so on. And they got no help. And rather, there's a kind of, we now outnumber you. Okay, now some people would say it actually was brought over from Ireland with a long tradition of kind of anti-landlord action against activism from the bottom up against the British, and that became part of this legacy. It's one of those questions that can't be answered, but I think it's really the real details of American life as to when they arrived, and again, the size, okay, and the way in which they just, so they move into Boston, so the Yankees move out. Okay, then they take over.
I'm not sure whether you just answered this question, but how did the immigrants who were Irish and Jewish secure the right to vote?
Oh, okay, so, it's a great question, and that one I can answer right away. Okay, they were white, and so there was universal white male suffrage, and there was never a time when they couldn't. Again, in some places, in the really early republic, there were a few places where it wasn't so much voting, but holding office. You had to swear in a King James Bible. Okay, in Pennsylvania, I believe. And a few, Maryland had that also. But for voting, they were white, they were men. Okay, so they got it.
So how did the Italian immigrants who had the same language barrier fit into the same narrative?
Okay, that's a great question. And again, that's like 2 or 3 books that haven't been written. For the answer, it's a very different pattern of migration, very different than the Irish and Jewish migration was actually kind of similar in that both groups were totally permanent. There was no going back. The Italians have a very high rate of return migration, probably more than a third go back. Okay, so once a population is committed to returning home, then there's no reason to naturalize and to become citizens and to participate in the political process, and therefore no ability to gain a foothold in that kind of power structure. So there are Jews serving in Congress, in the Massachusetts legislature, the Boston State Council, before they're Italians serving, although they come at the same time. And so that's, again, in the Boston, Massachusetts, it's Curley saying, okay, I'm sending that guy to Congress and not. Italian migration was heavily male, whereas the Jewish and the Irish migration was equally male and female, so it's a different economic and different family structure. But in a way, perhaps an answer to one of the questions was there, the Italians had nothing to offer the Jews. Okay, they controlled no institutions, I guess, maybe a little bit by the 20s and 30s in the crime world, but that's way overblown. But they had nothing to give them. They didn't control unions. Their women weren't teaching. The girls weren't teaching school. They weren't in the labor movement other than tiny. In fact, it was Jews who mentored Italians in the labor movement. So it's just a very different migration and a different kind of power relationship.
I have a question that I'll come to you. Where do you fit into this picture, the earlier Jewish immigration from Germany, a different class of Jews, and how do they fit into this?
Yes, so again, that's a great question. So obviously by the time the East European Jewish migration begins in the 1870s, there were about a quarter of a million Jews living in the United States, mostly from Central Europe, because they come earlier, they'd done pretty well, they were pretty comfortable in America. And they tended to very much, on the political level, align themselves with the Republicans and with this sort of good government progressive movement. And they were appalled that the Jews were all flocking to Tammany Hall. Okay, but they had nothing to offer the new immigrants. Tammany had, the shoes to give out and coal to give out and could get their kid out of prison or get their daughter a job. So the charities and the various helping organizations, and they were enormous. They had a huge budgets and so on of the other American Jews towards the immigrants was much more, attempting to remake them. Okay, so let's say the Jewish Board of Guardians in New York, when somebody would come in needing help, they had to, prove that they really needed it. When somebody came to Tammany and asked for a bail, I said, great, you can have it. You didn't have to prove anything. Why? Because again, Tammany wanted their vote. The Jewish Board of Guardians wanted to make sure that Jews were kind of upgrading themselves and becoming kind of much more civilized, middle class. And so in general, that older kind of, again, established swath of the American Jewish world, which was so small a number compared to the millions who come after 1870, had a very different place in American society than what the immigrants wanted. It's also, by the way, notable that many of those factories in which Jews worked, and in which their unions were suppressed, and in which they were treated horribly, were owned by other Jews. Okay, they were owned primarily by Jews of that earlier background. So Hillman worked at a huge men's clothing factory called Hart, Schaffner, and Marx. Okay, so Hart, Schaffner, and Marx were all the children of Jewish immigrants from someplace in Central Europe from the 1830s and 1840s. So it was, again, a relationship that was very different.
And we're gonna make this the last one. There you go.
I'm going to apologize in advance for this question because I appreciate full well that we're not living in the 1920s, but are there any lessons that can be drawn from this experience of allyship between the Irish people and the Jewish people that we can apply to healing or fostering allyship in today's world?
Yeah, I think that's a great one. And so first, it doesn't matter that it's a century later. So first, nobody makes it on their own. There's no such thing as pulling up one's bootstraps and making it, but as individuals and as communities, we, in a positive way, are dependent on each other. And what, rather than looking at the other for the bad things about them or the way they may not, you may be different, is to look at those common points of humanity. Okay, we're all working, we all need medical care, we all deserve clean water, and so on. And so rather than saying, I'm doing it for myself, it's like, how do we do this with others? And we may disagree with others on all sorts of issues. On this matter, we work together. It is a society in which I think people respect difference, but don't, in a sense, obsess on it, is really important. And that my issue and your issue will find a common meeting ground despite whatever differences we might have. And so, to me, that's the kind of really important takeaway is, again, the mutual dependence of people that is sometimes exploited for ill reasons, for nefarious reasons, not so recently. That's just not the way to have a democracy, and that's not the way to have a humane society.
That's the perfect ending for today. Thank you so much, Hasia Diner.
My
Thank you
pleasure.
for being here, everyone, and please come over for book purchases and conversation over to the side. And thank you, FCTV.